Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and we're still in Module 4. So first, the laws that sex workers want, I think that's the full name of it. Um, what I like about this uh, this video, so part of it is we hear a lot in society of the dominant, you know, you shouldn't. I think we get a lot of sex negative messages already. And I want to make sure that I'm providing alternate views of things. Um, I think that sex work is a really complicated issue, but I liked a lot of the ways that this speaker discussed the issues with laws as they stand. And for me, a lot of it comes down to unintended consequences. So we kind of have a plan of we're going to create this law that does this thing, but actually it may do a very different thing. And in the case of sex workers, those laws, she really demonstrates how they frequently make the work more dangerous for sex workers. Um, so first, she talks about places where it's illegal to carry condoms because if you have a condom in your possession on the street, that is evidence that you're a sex worker, which really just seems to make things a lot more dangerous for everyone. She also talks about exploitation by the police, so the risk that you will be sexually assaulted if as part of an arrest, so making that a more traumatic experience. And also, sex work has an inherent risk of danger from clients, including sexual assault, physical assault, and murder. She talks about how there's more safety when you can be, with other people, when you can be working in more public areas. And she also talks about how when clients are staying more hidden, so when clients are concerned about being prosecuted, if you are desperate, if you're doing this because you are desperate for the money, then you may be more likely to need a middle person who can contact, who knows where to find the clients, and that puts you at a lot more risk. Also, she talks about how having anonymous clients is much more dangerous because if they hurt you, there's really nothing to lead back to them. So there's much less sense of accountability for them. She talks about the cycles of needing money and how, particularly when you have, she talks in a couple different places. One, she mentions that once you have this criminal record, it becomes really difficult if you want to transition into different work because you have this, and not just a criminal record, but a very stigmatized criminal record. And then she also talks about, when you find certain behaviors, then the person is very motivated to get in even more money to pay off the fine, but the activity that helps them pay off the fine is also stigmatized, or is what will lead to more fines. So you get in these cycles that are really difficult to break out of. She also talks about the populations that are most vulnerable are always going to be refugees, migrants, and the more a system is criminalized, the fewer rights and abilities they have to get out of it. And I think I was trying to make things better and I made them worse. And this happens a lot with underage people too. I see a lot of pushback against headlines that portray underage sex workers as prostitutes when they are very, 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 very likely to be actually victims. And she talked about how these policies just reinforce stigma and hatred. And I am big on being direct. And so if we just want to say that we think that sex workers, like if you sell sex, you are worthless and deserve whatever violence may happen to you, then let's just say it directly instead of pretending that we're making laws that protect people. And I really liked the way that I think often laws that stigmatize or degrade people come from the people who are in power really not being able or willing to imagine people they love being in that situation. And so she says, people always go back to the question, do you want your daughter doing it? And the thing is, there's a lot of jobs that I don't want my children to do. I don't want my children working in like a chicken factory or in a, playing professional football, quite honestly. And so the better question, the more important question is, imagine that your daughter is doing it or your son. We focus on women sex workers. There are male sex workers also. There's trans sex workers who are at very high risk for violence. But imagine your child is doing it. Are they safe? And why aren't they safer? And I think that is such a powerful statement if you can get people to do that perspective taking, to imagine that that might happen. Next up, every time I see even this YouTube video, let alone, I'm trying to think if I've watched the documentary more than once. I always forget how sad it is, and that theme's just going to get bigger next week with violence. So make sure you've got self-care planned, as I've talked about. So Rashida Jones, I adore her from The Office and from Parks and Rec in particular. And she talks about becoming an accident, how she kind of accidentally got into this, and then, as one does, went on to make a series of documentaries about it. She talks about, and I'm going to skip down a little on my list, she uses the phrase, the pornification of pop culture. And that's really what got her on this track. And she talks about the range of pornography, that there's this range. And so when we think, particularly, I'm shocked every time I hear that the average age of first viewing of porn is 11. And again, I'm curious how people find that number, what kind of bias there might be, whether it's too low, I hope, or it might be too high. I don't know. We could also have, one group of people who are watching porn very, very young, and another group of people who are watching it much older. It also might be the subset of, of people of a certain age who have already watched porn. What age were you? Which is a very different question, because I at least hope that there's some group of people who are not watching porn and, up to the age 18 or older or so. So anyway, I'm skeptical of every figure I hear anywhere, but I think it's still, no matter what, it tells us that there are very young children watching porn, and that your first exposure to sex being through porn, there's a whole range of terrible that can be, from, okay, not great, but not awful, to really, really, really bad. And this gets revisited next week when we think there's one about how porn changes the way, I don't know if that one's specifically aimed at men, but about how people think about sex, and tying it particularly to violent sex. So she talks about predatory practices in what's called amateur porn, and then there's clips. She describes things that are described in the documentary, and she shows little clips of the documentary, and it's just this whole litany of things I wish I didn't know existed. And she used, so then she talked about the pornification of pop culture and how, porn norms have kind of made their way into pop culture, and that many of the most talented female artists are doing very sexualized images and actions. And I believe her when she says she struggles with this, that it may be empowering. I also suspect there's some things she's leaving out about her views. Part of it is, to some extent they are also, it may be, they are very talented, but who's to say that there's not very similarly talented people who don't make it big because they don't go as sexualized as these artists do, or a sense of that is how you make money. So if you are motivated to make money and you have the talent to support it, this is what you're going to do. So I think it's tough, and I think I really like how she expresses the conflict of the difficulty of trying to be sex positive and respect women's choices, and also push back against the sexualization, particularly of figures that are being looked up to by young girls. So touching back on what we talked about the sexualization of girls. I loved her phrase, the homogenized myopic message. So homogenized, I always think of milk because it'll say homogenized, and that means that they've shaken it up really good and taken all the cream out to make sure that it all feels very smooth. It's not like a clump of cream here and then watery milk down at the bottom. So homogenized means homo, same, and so it's kind of all the same. So we get a sense of there's one way to be attractive and popular and talented. And that way is to kind of look like you might be doing porn. And then also myopic, meaning short-sighted. So this very like in the moment, there's only one way to be, and not really thinking about what that means or what that's saying about women or what kind of opportunities it might be giving or not giving to women. So this one is really hard for me to watch every time I watch it, but I also think it's really important to know that it exists, even though I kind of wish I didn't. This next one, so I haven't watched this one, Hot Girls Wanted Turned On. It looks like it's also on Netflix. I don't know if it's still on Netflix. I don't have Netflix right now. But it popped up when I was looking for the first one, and I thought it was interesting just to kind of show just a glimpse of the idea that it's possible that there is pornography that at least is more empowering and better for women. And again, I want to avoid in this setting, getting into a big ethics conversation around things like sex and porn. But I just wanted to offer it as another kind of a growth of specifically Rashida Jones's work. She talked about how there's so many different stories to tell, and viewing it as a way to try to support people having conversations about their relationships, and I assume kind of about their desires and what they want to see. And then there's kind of an interesting snippet where she talks about female directors and how there's a lot more attributed to a woman's gender, that like, oh, well, if she did a movie and it didn't do well, then like not only is she no good, but women are no good, instead of just, okay, that was a bad movie, let's see what you can do next. And I love the way she frames like, oh, well, we tried with a woman. And I think that often happens with women and with other underrepresented, underprivileged, underpowered minorities or groups. But I think particularly with women. Well, women are the focus of our class. And so then when you think about, you layer on other factors, so someone who is underprivileged both in terms of gender and sexuality, or gender and race, or all three, and lots of other things, you can see how there can be a lot of pressure that any mistake is attributed to who you are and used to further dismiss you. So what did I leave out? Here I talked very little. One or two of the videos mentioned LGBTQIA issues. I know in the lecture itself, I mentioned once or twice kind of that trans individuals, trans women are at higher risk for health issues. We also didn't talk about stigmatized relationships in general. So we've got LGBTQIA. We've also got people who are mismatched, so not what society would expect matches. So race and ethnicity is sort of the first one that comes to mind, but there's lots of other, and gender I kind of stuck there as well. But you can also think people who aren't a match by age, religion, physical attractiveness, social class, and that can be a stigma. Society really likes people to kind of fit together the way we expect, the way we do on sitcoms from 20 years ago. There's also issues, and this gets into more often international things, of arranged marriages versus love matches. So in some places, arranged marriage, where you work with your parents to choose a partner, it may still be the norm, and it's sort of like arranged marriages may be stigmatized in places like the US, and love matches, so people who fall in love and get married based on that, may be stigmatized in other places. Another big one is affairs. So my background's grief and loss, and we talk about grief that is not acknowledged, that is socially sort of unsupported. And a big one is affairs. And you might have a short-term affair or a long-term affair. So for grief, we know, you might be someone's partner for, decades and be completely like not acceptable to attend the funeral or mourn publicly in any way because you were a mistress or, someone on the side. And also we don't talk, I don't think anything mentioned polyamory. So people where, we think of monogamy as the ideal. And so we don't think about relationships where there may be multiple consenting adult relationships that are not meant to be monogamous, that are where it's kind of acknowledged that it is a different approach to relationships. And so when you add stigma onto any of those relationships, I think sex and sexuality gets more difficult. And also by not talking about them in this lecture, I contribute to their invisibility and their lack of power. We also not much talked about how sex, something changed. I don't know. I think the clouds came out a little or went away a little. But we didn't talk much about how sex is important for relationships and how sexual satisfaction can relate to relationship satisfaction. We didn't talk much about underrepresented groups in general. I think all of the speakers might have been white this time. That's not great. And we just barely touched on abortion. We really didn't talk about access and attitudes toward contraception and abortion, or family planning of any kind. So those are things that we didn't talk about that would be very relevant and appropriate. I am open to you bringing these things in through your discussion posts, but I do want to remind you to be sensitive to our setting, and especially around, as much as possible, avoid discussing the morality or the acceptability of things, and instead just focus on describing what's happening and how society and gender roles and norms are affecting the groups involved. Again, next week is even harder than this week for me, at least. So keep in mind, be mindful of who's around while you're watching videos. Hopefully you've already figured that out with some of these. And also, just plan some self-care because it gets heavy. Know who your people are that you can talk about, including within the class. And it may be fine. It may be a good time to use the check-in a little extra. And remember, you can get some bonus points. I typically up to about 5 points bonus on each discussion. I'll give you about a bonus point for every extra post that you make. Yeah. So I will see you next week. Take care.